Hello everyone and welcome. Today we are gonna make this fire projectile traveling through space effect in Blender using only the basic primitives and a shader editor. Also, if you don't feel like following the tutorial, then you can get this blend file from my Gumroad. You will find the link in the description. So without further ado, let's jump right into Blender. Let's start with an empty scene. And first of all, let's make sure that you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. So just go to add-ons, search for Node Wrangler and make sure that it's on, because we will use it a bit later. First of all, let's create a mesh, a UV sphere. And as you can see, the UV sphere has a pole on the top and the bottom. So we need to make sure that the pole is facing the direction in which this projectile is gonna go. So in our case, we will move it on the y-axis. So let's rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Also, we will only need 1/2, so you can delete the other one. Now let's move it a little bit further and add another primitive. This time it's gonna be a cylinder. And this one, let's also rotate on the x-axis by 90 degrees, so that it's facing the same direction. Let's also scale it on the y-axis. To scale it only on one axis, you have to hit the S button and then hold Shift and click Y. And that will allow you to scale it on both X and Z without the y-axis. So let's scale it a little bit, make it longer, something like this. Later you can adjust it, but just so we have the base shape, this will gonna be our projectile. Let's also name our meshes, because later we'll have quite a few of them, so just for the ease of navigating later on. Alright, and now let's select the blast front, the front of it, and switch to the shading tab on top. And here, under the viewport shading, let's turn down the world opacity so that we can see it better. Now let's click new to create new material and also name it. We can delete the principled BSDF material, because we will use emission, so we don't need it for now. And let's start with Voronoi texture. Now if you hold down Ctrl Shift and click the node with your left mouse button, it will give you this viewer node if you have the Node Wrangler enabled, and that will basically let us preview any node in our node tree, so it's just very comfortable. Now with this node selected, let's click Ctrl and T to get those two nodes. Again, this is a feature of Node Wrangler, so make sure that you have it enabled. And let's switch from generated to UV. Also make sure to save the file, just in case. Alright, and first of all, let's play with the scale value a little bit here, to give ourselves a little bit more of this pattern. And now to make it more stretchy, let's play with the scale down here in the mapping node. So let's bring it down on the y-axis, because our models are aligned to the y-axis. So we need to decrease it here to make it more stretchy. We can also increase the x-axis to get a little bit more of those. Right. Now let's add a color ramp after the Voronoi texture. Change the interpolation from linear to constant so that we have a harsh black and white contrast. And now we can play with this one a little bit. And this will be the base of the face of the effect. Now we will also animate it using the mapping node with the help of drivers. So simply type in #frame divided by, let's say 50. What this will do is, let's bring up a timeline here. It will basically change this value based on the frame that the animation is currently on. So if you click play, you can see that it's getting animated as the animation bar progresses basically. Let's stretch it out a little bit on the y-axis to give it more speedy look. We can also, what we can do is give a little bit of rotation to our effect. So let's put another driver here, hashtag frame, and this one is divided by something bigger, like 100, because we don't want it to rotate too fast, but this one's maybe a little bit too slow. 60, yeah, 60 seems fine. So you can see as it whooshes back, it also rotates a little bit clockwise. Now one thing we can do to improve it is, as you can see right now, it's being cut off here in this very straight line, very clean straight cut. So what we can do is add another node. This time it is a gradient node, and again with this node selected, Ctrl T to get another mapping and texture coordinates, and this time let's change it from generated to object, and again hold down Ctrl, Shift and left mouse click to preview what this node outputs basically. And we would like to have a gradient, but we need to rotate it so that it progresses from white at the top to black at the end. So let's rotate it on the y-axis by 90 degrees. And let's also add a little bit of irregularities here, because right now it's very fine gradient and it's same everywhere. So for that we will need a mix RGB node in between. Let's bring it a little bit up, this one back, and we will need also a noise texture. Let's connect the vector from mapping to the noise texture and the color from the noise texture to the mix RGB color, and change the mix to linear light. Let's crank it up all the way up, and now with playing with the scale, detail and distortion, you can change the mask, and we can also animate it by switching from 3D to 4D and adding another driver to this W value, because this W value is sort of a seed value for this noise texture. So let's add a driver frame divided by, let's say 60 as well. Maybe a bit lower so that it changes faster. 40 should be alright. And now, because we are going for this cartoony look, we don't really want these gray values. We want this mask to be a sharp black and white mask. So for that, after gradient texture, let's add a color ramp. Change again the interpolation from linear to constant and bring it down the white values until you're satisfied with how much is visible and not visible. Basically everything that is white is gonna be visible and what is black is gonna be transparent. Right now this noise is quite messy, so let me just bring down some of the values to make it a little bit more uniform. Maybe also bring down the factor of the linear light. Something like this should be alright. Now if we check it out, that's how much is gonna be visible. It's quite good. And now we need to combine this mask with our whooshing effect. But before that, let's add some color, because so far it's just black and white and we are going for this fiery blast look. So let's play around it here in this color ramp. Let's change this white into, let's start with something orangey, pull it down. Let's add another one, bringing just before this orange, and change it this time to something more yellowish. Yep, this is alright. Now let's add a emission shader node and plug this color ramp to emission. add a transparent BSDF, and also we will need a mix shader, just so that we will know where our material is going to be transparent and where we will see those red and yellow flames. So let's connect both here, and the factor is going to be basically the mask, and the mask we will get from a math node. Let's take it from the color ramp, plug it in here, and change it from add to greater than. And now let's also preview this math node, and make sure that the threshold is something very small, like 0.1, so that anything that is not black is gonna be visible. Now if we plug this one to our mix shader and preview that, we can still see that these black areas are still black. And this is because we need to go to our material tab, material properties, and change the blend mode from opaque to alpha clip. And now as you can see we have the transparency. But again we have those sharp edges, and we already created the mask that will cut them out. Now all we need to do is combine this one with this, and we can do that simply by a mix RGB node again. Let's move those nodes a little bit further to make more space, and connect both color ramps to this mix RGB node. Change the mix to multiply and crank the factor all the way up. Now if you preview this multiply, you can see that our effect is not getting all the way to the edge of our mesh, but it's being cut out by the noise that we set up here. Now let's connect this mix RGB to our greater than instead of this color ramp, and let's cut this one out, just like that, so that our final mask is gonna be adjusted with that noise. Now let's preview our mix shader, and if we click play, we can already see the base of our effect. Now one thing we can do to make it look more like fiery blast is crank up the emission to, let's say, 5, and also go to the render settings and turn on bloom. That will give us this nice effect. Also make sure that you're in the Eevee render engine, so that you have those effects in real time. Now is also a good time if you want to adjust some of those colors. You can do it in this color ramp. Basically take those sliders and move them in and out depending on your liking. You can also add new colors, change it to something like blue, or stay consistent with yellow on the insides. Yeah, that seems alright. Now let's move to the next part, which is the core of our effect, this cylinder. For this, let's also create a new material, name it a blast core, and we can also delete the BSDF, the principled BSDF. And again, let's start with Voronoi texture. This is gonna be very similar but much simpler version of what we did before. So simply, again, click Ctrl T to get the mapping and texture coordinate node. We can switch from generated to object, and let's preview how it looks like. As you can see that our texture is already stretched, even though in mapping node the scale is equal on each axis, and that is because we scaled the mesh itself on the y-axis. And in order to get rid of that stretching, you can simply click Ctrl 8 and apply the rotation and scale. And now we can start working with the mesh. So for this we will actually adjust the scale on the y-axis again to have it stretched. But it's better if we do it by ourselves and have the full control over it than when it happens automatically without our knowledge. That's why we applied the rotation and scale. So let's change it to something like this. Let's also get this scale a little bit bigger, maybe 6. And add a color ramp at the end, very similarly as we did before. Let's move it a little bit. Change the interpolation from linear to constant. Bring it down. And change the type from F1 to smooth F1. Now we can start laying out our colors. So let's start with something maybe even reddish. Add another one, slightly lighter, something orangey. And maybe one more on the back, something yellowish. Let's stretch it out a little bit more even. Something like this, bring up the scale of the effect itself. And now we can also animate this on the y-axis as we did before with the blast. So simply add a driver, putting in hashtag frame. Let's divide it by, let's say 25. As you can see, it's already flowing. It's a little bit too slow. So let's put smaller number, maybe something like 10. 10 seems alright. And again, we will need the same setup as before at the end. So emission and transparent BSDF, and both of them will be connected in the mix shader node. And the factor again is gonna be a math node set to greater than, and it's gonna come from our color ramp. Let's put it to something small again, 0.1, to make sure that everything that is not black is gonna be visible. Let's put it in the factor, and now let's preview the mix shader. Again, make sure that the material has blend mode set from opaque to alpha clip, and also plug in the color ramp color to the emission color. Okay, the last thing you can do is bump up the strength of the emission to something like 5 maybe. And now we can adjust those values because you can see that there is way more yellow. And we would need some of those slightly less shiny colors pop out as well. Now if we click play, we can see that the basic is already done. One thing we can do is delete the caps of the cylinder. So simply go into edit mode using tab, and then with face selection, just select the end cap and delete the face here and also here. Maybe we can actually select the last edge and just extrude it a little bit and then scale it down, just so we have this sort of nose going in at the end. Right? And with that, this is the base of our effect. Now what we're gonna do is basically we're gonna lay on layer after layer of another noises on top to make it look a little bit better. But before that, what we can also do to enhance the look of our effect is, first of all, let's add some geometry. So click on the core, then go into edit mode, and using Ctrl R, add some subdivisions, just so that our mesh will have more vertices to work with. And now go to the modifier tab, open it up, choose displays, and then click new to create new texture. Give it some random name, doesn't really matter. And now under the texture properties, you can change the type to clouds. Now to animate this noise texture, as you probably could see in my previous videos, we will use the very same technique. So simply add an empty plane axis. Let's move it a little bit out. And here on the first frame, let's click I and choose location, which will add a keyframe on the first frame of the location of this plane axis. And now go to the last frame and move this axis on the y-axis somewhere here. And again, click I, location. And this will basically give us this plane axis moving from point A to B. And based on that, we can animate this displace texture that we applied to our mesh. Another thing which you may also do is, with the axis selected, hover over the timeline and click T and make sure that the interpolation between those two keyframes are set to linear, because I believe by default it's set to Bezier. Alright, and with this plane axis set up, we can go to our mesh modifier tab and change the coordinates from local to object, and the object is gonna be the plane axis that we just created. And now if you click play, you can see that the mesh is being animated. We can switch to rendered view to see how it affects our effect. So currently it's way too strong and way too hectic, but we can easily adjust that simply by going to the texture properties and change the size of our texture to something like maybe 0.6. And also, as you can see, we have those sharp edges, those pointy vertices. We can get rid of that simply by adding another modifier, which is subdivision surface, and that will smooth out some of those pointy vertices. Now we can play with the strength of our effect, but I would recommend to leave it at 1. Also, we can do the exact same thing with our blast front. We can add a modifier displace. Here, from the drop-down menu, we can choose the texture that we created before. It can be the same. The coordinates we can also change from local to object, and the object being the empty plane axis that we created before. Here, as you can see, it's way too strong, so we can simply decrease the strength to something like 0.3, maybe 0.4, just so we have this slight wobble, but it's just not too much. Let's also go and adjust it a little bit, because it seems slightly too thick for me, the effect. It occupies too much space. Yeah, just like that. And now the base of our effect is already done. So the next thing we will do is basically copy and slightly adjust our existing meshes. So let's start with the core. So let's just click Shift D and then S to scale it, then again Shift Y to scale it only on the X and the Z axis, and make sure that it's slightly bigger than its original. And we can jump into the shading editor and click this icon, which is basically gonna create new material based on the existing one. Let's change the name, Blast Core, to something like maybe Blast Embers, because this one is gonna be those small particles that will fly around. This is basically having the same sort of shader. The difference is gonna be the values. So here let's just delete some of the positions in the color ramp. Let's just leave one and take it all the way back here, just so that they are visible very, very slightly. Let's change the color from this red to something even darker, going into maybe even dark pink, something like this. And change also the Voronoi texture from smooth F1 to F2. Okay, this is now way too big. Let's scale it down, just so we only see some of those sparks. Now let's also change the scale of the Voronoi texture to make those particles bigger, maybe something like 4. Let's also go down to the mapping node and change the scale on the y-axis to make them less stretched, something like this. Let's also take the driver and change the value to something a little bit slower, so divided by 30 maybe. Let's try it out. It's a little bit too slow, so maybe something like 20. We can also go to the modifier tab and change the strength of our displays to something much higher, something like 2, maybe even 3. And now let's just click S to scale the mesh a little bit lower. And now, as you can see, you have those nice extra red sparks, red embers going in between our effect. I think it gives a nice nice addition to the whole thing. You can maybe set the color to something more. Yeah, I will leave it to you. You can adjust those values to your liking basically. So the next thing we will add is also those red embers but to the front. So let's just copy the front blast that we already have. So again, Shift D and then S to scale it. So again, Shift D and then right click to just leave it as it is. And let's click S to scale it a little bit bigger. And maybe let's make it more elongated on the y-axis and move it somewhere here. And as we did previously, let's click again this icon to create new material based on the old one and change it blast to something like blast from embers. And this again, all we will change is basically the values of the nodes that we already have set up here. So let's start with the color ramp. Again, let's delete some of those values here. Let's keep just one and put it somewhere here, just so that we have a little bit of that effect visible. Again, set it to something red. Change the scale on the y-axis in the mapping node, just so that it's not so stretched, but rather something that reminds more of a embers. And maybe let's bump the scale of the Voronoi texture itself. And now if we check it out, it adds another layer to our effect. Maybe move it a little bit further so that it's synced in with all the effect itself. Alright, and the last thing is that white-ish core in the very middle. So for that one, let's select the blast core itself. And again, Shift D to copy it, then the right mouse button to just leave it in the original place and scale it down using Shift Y so that we only scale it on the Z and X axis. Something smaller. And again, let's create another material based on the old one. And Blast Core White sounds like a name, good as any. Now again, same as before, all of this is just a matter of changing the values. So let's make sure that it's more full, that it has less transparency overall, so that it appears more solid overall. Let's bring those values in and make them slightly brighter into the white-ish regions. With the white at the very core. You can also make it even more stretched, since it's in the middle on the y-axis. That seems alright. Now let's play. So yeah, this is the core of the effect. Now for the air particles, let's create a simple plane, scale it up, bring it a little bit higher. Now go to the shading tab, create new material, air whooshes, name good as any, delete the principled BSDF, and this one is super simple, just create a noise texture, nope, not white noise, normal noise texture, Ctrl T, change the texture coordinate to from object, get a color ramp, and again a emission, transparent, and mix shader, just like with the previous ones. Let's connect all of those. Now let's connect also the noise texture to the color ramp, change it to constant again, and connect it to emission with strength 1 because we don't want it to emit bloom or anything. Let's add a math node that will come actually not from the color ramp but from the noise texture. So this is a slight difference. Change it from add to greater than. Now let's plug it in here. Let's check that mix shader, and now we see everything is black because we need to change the colors in the color ramp. So let's bring it a little bit down And here the thing is, with your greater than math node, you control basically how much is gonna be visible. And then with your color ramp, you control which parts are gonna be white and which are gonna be black. So now all there is to it is change the scale on the mapping node so that the air whooshes are very thin and very directional. Let's bump the scale on the noise texture. Maybe let's bring in the distortion a little bit, the detail, the roughness. And make sure that the material also is set to alpha clip. Let's also maybe flip it so that we have the black on the outside and the white on the inside. I feel it looks better. The directionality is wrong, so not this one, y-axis. Something like this. Now simply let's create a driver again on the location y frame divided by, let's say 15. That will be fast enough. Maybe a bit too fast. Still too fast. So a bit too slow. Maybe like 65. Okay, but now it's going in the wrong direction. So let's just add a minus at the beginning. And now let's copy it and bring it a little bit down to be below our effect as well. And as you can see, this is basically the whole effect. Now, of course, the preview that you've seen at the beginning of the video is slightly different. It is simply because I was fiddling with it way longer and I was adjusting those values and whatnot just so that it looks nice. But what I did now in this tutorial is gave you the basics, the very core principles that let me create that effect. So I would love to see your creative vision and your creations based on the knowledge that you just got. So if you manage to create something out of this tutorial, then I would love to see that on, you can tag me either on my Twitter or Instagram. Link to both of those are in the description. So I hope you liked it, I hope you learned something, and I'm sorry for the break, the longer break that I took. I just had some health problems and I'm still not 100% okay, but I'm getting better, so I will try to be more regular with my uploads. So yeah, that's it. See you in the next one, I guess.